各位歡迎收睇26分鐘見證實錄。根據世界衛生組織嘅定義，患病人數佔總人口數字大約0.05%就屬於罕見疾病。雖然本國並冇罕見病相關嘅政策，但係相關嘅患者預計有超過100萬人。相比一般嘅疾病，罕見病患者喺求醫、治療、取得藥物嘅過程，會面對啲乜嘢挑戰呢？臨床試驗治療又可以點樣幫助佢哋呢？
My husband sometimes says to me, "It's like, aren't you angry about this?" And I was like, "What would that do? What would that accomplish?"
罕見病確診路上挑戰重重，確診之後，患者需要同罕見病一生共存，過住與眾不同嘅生活。
A sense of loneliness, because who can you relate to? If you got this rare disease, who do you talk to? Who understands what you're going through? It can be very lonely, and for families as well, trying to support their loved one. Where do they get information? There's fewer sources of information, and so that sense of isolation, I think, is really important to acknowledge.
本國並未為罕見病設下定義，欠缺相應嘅孤兒藥發展政策。罕見病病人只能夠喺一般嘅醫療體系夾縫中摸索同尋找適合自己嘅醫療方案。
There's not really any system that I have experienced where I could be referred to by my doctor.
When you have 45 countries that approve a drug as effective, the government of Canada tells us that the drug is effective. I do not understand why each province needs to review this and decide if the drug is effective and if it works. As a parent with a child with this disease, it just makes no sense.
罕見病患者何去何從？罕見人生中面對啲乜嘢挑戰呢？今年40初嘅 Susan 望落去健全健康，不過原來佢27歲嘅時候，身體開始出現不正常反應。
I stepped down off of like a cement barricade. We were just walking through the street, and all of a sudden, both my feet just started tingling. And I was like, you know that feeling where you just kind of shake your hand, like it'll come back, like the circulation will come back. And so I was shaking my feet, being like, oh, that's weird. What happened? And the feeling didn't come back. They stayed that way for about 3 weeks. In just that sort of weird, the feeling should come back, but it didn't, it wasn't.
佢感覺到身體反應唔正常之後求醫，當時醫生同佢講可能只係血糖低，身體之後回復正常。直到1年之後病情復發，醫生轉介佢到神經科，建議佢做磁力共振成像，以進一步了解病情。
I woke up the morning that it was rescheduled for, and I couldn't see out of my left eye. I couldn't see. It was like a really thick fabric over it, and so you could see sort of through some of the certain sections, but so I could see here and here. But that was pretty much it. I had and it was sort of this weird grayish green mass.
完成磁力共振成像嘅 Susan 當年已經31歲，之後見咗另一位神經科醫生，認為佢患上多發性硬化。
So for MS, I was diagnosed in 2011, August of 2011, and they put me on a drug that was like an intramuscular injection once a week. It was not very nice. It was like my least favorite drug that I've ever had to take throughout this whole ordeal, because it would give you flu-like symptoms. So you would get chills and your muscles would ache, and it was every week. And you couldn't get away from it.
不過到2014年 ，Susan 又再病發，雙手神經出現問題，唔能夠用餐具、綁鞋帶等。之後再去求醫，先至發現原來自己患上嘅並唔係多發性硬化，而係一種罕見疾病。
My neurologist in Victoria, who's fantastic, she looked at my MRI and she's like, "This isn't MS." She's like, even though I'd had the blood test and I didn't have the antibodies or whatever, she's like, I don't think this is MS. I'm going to send you. She's like, I'm going to send you to Dr. Tbilisi in Vancouver. He's like the specialist in NMO, and I'm going to send you there. And I was like, okay. So I went and saw him. He's fantastic. And he was like, yeah, you have 4 out of the 5 diagnostic criteria for this, we're going to call it as NMO. So, yeah, which I would say is appropriate. I could just get hit by a car tomorrow. You're like, it's the same thing, basically. So you're like, okay, so I'll just live with it, move on, and take it as it comes and deal with it.
If I look at our numbers in British Columbia, we have about 6,000 people in British Columbia with multiple sclerosis, really common disease. But with neuromyelitis optica, there's about 200. So much less common. And that's part of the reason why there's often a delay in diagnosis.
視神經脊髓炎係一種點樣嘅疾病？又同多發性硬化症有啲乜嘢唔同呢？
NMO is a rare disease. It affects the nervous system, especially the optic nerves and the spinal cord. And it's an autoimmune condition, and it can cause sudden blindness or sudden paralysis, which can be quite frightening. It's more common in women than in men, and I've seen it happen at all ages, from children, young adults, and older people. Fortunately, it's quite rare, but it can be often mistaken for multiple sclerosis because the symptoms can be very similar. The main difference is it's much more severe. There's no real warning. Sometimes the symptoms might be a little weird starting off, like, oh, my vision's a little bit blurry, I'm feeling a little unwell. But then it can really hit like a truck. It can just be so aggressive. And within 24 to 72 hours, a person can go from good vision to complete blindness. It's really not to frighten people, but it is frightening.
Dr. Trabowski 醫生表示，視神經脊髓炎同自體免疫疾病一樣，都係病因不明。咁復發嘅次數同幾時係下一次復發都係未知。
It can be pretty random. My general experience is once they have their first attack, loss of vision or weakness, sometimes the second and third attack can be within months. They can really cluster together. And then other people, they might go for, longest I saw was 20 years between attacks, which is really an extreme example. But on average, untreated, people would have at least one attack a year. And it can be, the attacks can vary in severity, but often without treatment, those attacks can leave permanent disability behind.
佢表示，同好多罕見疾病一樣，最具挑戰嘅係作出及時嘅診斷。
It is challenging. With any rare disease, part of the challenge is doctors recognizing the disease, because many doctors might recognize, oh yeah, that's a problem with the optic nerve, optic neuritis. It must be multiple sclerosis. And that's the first conclusion they're going to jump to. And so one of the key things we've been trying to do is raise awareness in the province that for doctors, neurologists to be aware of this so that they can rapidly send people to us and then we can get them on the right treatment.
幸好嘅係現時可以透過血液測試幫助醫生作出診斷。
It was developed really about 10 years ago, a collaboration between researchers in Japan and the Mayo Clinic in the United States. In the past, this disease used to be called Asian multiple sclerosis. And so there was quite a few people in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan with this disease. And so there was this nice collaboration with the Mayo Clinic to identify this antibody. And that really changed how we recognize and treat the disease.
喺2017年 ，Susan 參與一項臨床試驗治療，試驗一種名為 Aspirin 嘅藥物嘅效用。
Yeah, it was just an option to go into the clinical trial and try this drug, and I thought, this sounds good. It's something that, and I also had a lot of, because it's a clinical trial, you have a lot more doctor attention and nurses, so you're seeing a doctor every 4 weeks. They put me on the drug. So it's been almost 3 years, and I haven't had a flare-up at all. So yeah, so that's what it's trying to prevent, because the flare-ups can cause scar tissue on your nerves, which is what causes the disability for people.
最終 Aspirin 今年獲加拿大衛生部批准，用於治療視神經脊髓炎。
It's a monoclonal antibody, a smart bomb, a biological drug that a person has to take once a month, and really well tolerated, and it blocks a certain receptor in the body that is part of the pathway of inflammation. And it's so focused on that pathway that it doesn't cause other side effects. It doesn't affect the whole immune system, so the person is not getting a whole bunch of infections because we're messing with the immune system, but it beautifully controls the disease. It's one of the most effective treatments we've seen for this disease, and we've got good evidence that it works. And that's what we've always been lacking, we've been trying different treatments, hoping it works, but not having the confidence of evidence that we're doing the right things.
Dr. Tribos 醫生相信臨床試驗治療可以幫助患者。
The other aspect too is entering into a clinical trial. You're usually about 10 years ahead of the curve. From the time a drug gets into what's called a phase 2 or phase 3 trial until it's easily available on the market, it's about 10 years. And so these folks that started off in our studies getting access to the drug will be on these treatments for over 10 years without any worries about having access. It's really kind of cool.
不過研究同尋求罕見疾病治療嘅過程，對研究者、醫生同患者嚟講都係相當漫長同充滿挑戰。
Just in general, there's less research on rare diseases because there's less research funding available for rare diseases. In Canada, there's some countries like England have a very special program for rare diseases to advance research, and that's in the case of NMO as well. So I'm hoping that'll happen in Canada in the future. It's much easier to convince government to support a drug like this when there is that clinical trial data saying this is truly an effective drug. If there's not that evidence, it's really hard to convince people to pay for it, understandably.
雖然一啲藥廠為負擔唔起藥費嘅人提供優惠項目，高昂嘅藥費始終都為患者增添經濟負擔。
You know, when a new drug comes to market, especially for a rare disease, they tend to be more expensive than older drugs, especially if it's called a biologic, these designer drugs. And so often that's why we might be encouraged to try the cheaper drugs first and then apply for access to the more expensive drugs if the cheaper drugs aren't working.
We had third-party insurance, but I realized that if you don't have that, if you're not working or your spouse doesn't have that or however your family doesn't have that, it would be pretty tricky. So it was each syringe at the time. Now this was a different drug, like I say, and not the same company. Each syringe was about $400, and I had to have one each week. So yeah, so it was expensive for the first 3 months, I think. But like I say, we had third-party coverage for that.
相比一般嘅疾病，有關罕見病嘅研究同文獻相對少好多，導致診斷時間延長，而用於治療嘅藥物往往未被研發或者係價格昂貴。罕見病患者點樣面對呢啲挑戰呢？下一節翻嚟再睇。藥物係控制病情嘅重要方法。咁不過，如果治療費用係天價，咁患者同家屬可以點樣選擇呢？而如果患上一種無法治癒嘅罕見病，患者又可以點樣透過定量運動保持健康呢？
They weren't working well, and it was because of a genetic condition. And so I had 86% of my mitochondria in my body were not working to task. They weren't performing as well as they should have.
今年57歲嘅 Elizabeth 10年前確診患上簡稱 MERV 症候群嘅罕見病。咁佢話呢個病係一種遺傳線粒體疾病，佢家族全部人都對呢個病呈陽性反應。
So in my case, it accumulated in my shoulders and in my back. And I was the most severe out of my siblings that did have that presentation. And in my situation, it got to the point where I could not sleep well. I was not comfortable. I couldn't find clothes that fit me. I felt extremely self-conscious and functionally it was very difficult for me to do something as simple as driving because I couldn't turn my neck from side to side because I had a very large mass on my upper middle back.
佢又話 MERV 症候群嘅患病比率係1/5000，而全省只有3個家庭患有呢種病。咁不過呢種線粒體疾病同其他常見病息息相關。
Obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, they're saying there's a problem, there's a connection to energy dysregulation, right? So now that category is like 300 diseases that they say have at their core or at their base a problem with mitochondrial functioning.
喺2016年，佢接受手術將肩背重3公斤嘅脂肪切除。咁不過之後面對新陳代謝危機。
I couldn't walk for long periods of time. They call it debilitating fatigue. I had been quite active prior to that state, and I was unable to exercise at all following that crisis. And so that's how it presented for me, but it could be different for anybody that has this disease.
由確診開始 ，Elizabeth 嘅個案一直由一間本地專科診所跟進，為佢提供心理支持、社工服務等嘅支援。咁不過 Elizabeth 覺得整個醫療體系仍然有好大不足。
My physician, for example, my primary care physician, knew nothing about this disease. Nothing. And so it really is a limited resource in the province in terms of accessibility for clients or patients that have this condition. That is Vancouver and Victoria, and only a very small number of doctors actually have knowledge about this disease. It became clear to me that my medical team really had no options other than to wait and see. I was, I think, 53 at that time, 53 years old. And so I really wasn't happy with that option. I mean, what option was there? There was nothing really.
佢認為唔應該浪費時間白白等待，喺主動自行研究相關文獻之後，向醫療團隊表示希望得到運動方面嘅幫助。咁之後同西門菲沙大學嘅定量運動團隊合作，每星期運動4次，每次2小時。負責為佢設計運動項目嘅 Jack 表示 ，Elizabeth 嘅表現一直提升，對比初時有好大進步。
We will rely on scientific principles that pull research from biomechanics, anatomy, and physiology to prescribe exercise in a progressive and safe way. And one of the things that was really interesting with Elizabeth is, her progress has been tremendous. When she first started seeing me, she was at a stage where she had trouble doing body weight squats, right? So just going from standing to a full range of motion body weight squat. And over the course of the time working with me, she's gone up to a barbell back squat with 130 pounds on her back for 5 repetitions.
西門菲沙大學生物醫學生理學與運動學系副教授 Dr. Dave Clark 表示，以循證實踐為基礎嘅定量運動可以幫助人提升體能表現。
When you get a case, you use the best available evidence to justify decisions about how you diagnose the patient and how you treat them or manage their condition. And it also really highlights any contraindications or issues that could arise. And that's what exercise programmers really need to know is, can the exercise be dangerous for this particular person? Exercise always carries with it some risk. Usually the risk is very, very low. Her specific disease is certainly understudied, but that's the case for anyone with a rare disease. And so in any case, so we have to use additional sorts of information. We also start conservatively and progress the intensity and the duration of the exercise so that we mitigate the risks of doing harm at the beginning, and we watch and we collect data on the person as they go through the program.
同時 ，Elizabeth 都嘗試唔同嘅食療，加上改善睡眠作息等日常生活配合運動，希望可以提升整體健康。Elizabeth 對健康付出好大嘅努力，自發進行嘅全方位健康管理成果亦都相當顯著。佢希望醫療系統可以提供更全面嘅治療配套，亦都鼓勵病人為健康多做主動。
I found that most physicians that I've dealt with in the last 3 or 4 years have very little understanding or training even around things like nutrition and a more holistic approach to healthcare management. So everybody's unique. What happened for me may not happen for other people. And if other people are encouraged to maybe do their own research, I strongly encourage them to do that. But you should also work with your doctor. Like, you can't just ignore your doctor's advice.
When you have a patient with a chronic disease, oftentimes there are no solutions. There's no therapeutic solution. So what Elizabeth did really well is she really took it upon herself to become informed and read and learn.
同樣認為醫療系統對罕見病病人同家屬支援不足嘅，仲有 ambulance.
There is definitely a gap in supporting people families who have children with not only SMA, but with other disabilities in terms of coordinating all the agencies, repeating the same information about Miles's diagnosis to social therapists, to dietitian, to neurology, to orthopedics, and then repeat it to the school, and then repeat it to the community occupational therapists. And there's respite in the community. So there is a constant repeat. It's not, the parent is the central repository of all that information. And we carry this all the time, and we must fight all the agencies for support and requirements. So it is constant. The burden is on the parent.
Anne 嘅兒子 Miles 今年15歲，喺13個月大嘅時候確診脊髓肌肉萎縮症第2型，係罕見病嘅一種。至少 Miles 嘅手腳同肌肉都無力，活動能力有限，只可以喺輪椅上生活，大小事都要由家人照顧。
As a parent, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, the diagnosis itself, because this is not, the path you thought a life with your child would take. So there's that challenge. And there's also the challenge, of the mental challenge of hearing your child say this. And there's other mental challenges in dealing with the school system and inclusion in the medical system. From a physical aspect on my part, where there's the lifting, lifting him in and out. And my son requires, most patients with SMA requires help 24/7 for daily activities. So personal care, dressing, meals, everything. So from a physical standpoint, there's that. Emotional, it's very challenging.
脊髓肌肉萎縮症一直無藥可醫，直到2016年出現一種名為 Spinraza 嘅治療藥物，不過第1年嘅定價係75萬美元，之後每年係37.5萬美元。
The social justice aspect, you develop a drug that no one can afford, and you hold the parents hostage to either pay for it or watch their child regress. So it is challenging. The manufacturer of the drug has negotiates with every single country the price that it would sell this.
雖然藥物得到加拿大衛生部批准，但各省份會對藥物分別評估再定出覆蓋範圍。而喺卑斯省 ，Spinraza 只係覆蓋脊髓肌肉萎縮症第1型患者，或者係冇病徵但係確診患上第2型嘅嬰兒。同埋12歲以下從來未能夠行路嘅患者，令其他未能夠受惠嘅患者同家屬覺得無奈。
For example, Quebec funds Spinraza for all patients for all types, from the weakest type 1 to type 4s. BC has stronger parameters. They will fund up to the age of 12 if the child has never walked. If the child has never walked. I have friends whose children are young enough and have received Spinraza on trial, during the trial, and now that they are walking, the drug is yanked from them. The drug is taken away. So from a social justice perspective, how can this be? How can this be tolerated and accepted in Canada? This is not who we are.
Anne 同時亦都係關注組織 Cure SMA 加拿大卑斯省分部嘅主席，該協會亦都曾經就此表達不滿。
Canada-wide, how as a society, as a group, do we all work together, all provinces, to ensure that we're supported? And again, it's just not about SMA. It's about, of course, my son is affected by SMA, but the national rare disease drug policy affects other families as well.
Spinraza 獲卑斯省批准嘅時候，由於 Miles 年滿12歲，唔符合藥物覆蓋資格 ，Anne 向省府爭取覆核，最終省衛生廳今年批准 Miles 嘅個案。佢希望本國同各省未來可以有一致嘅罕見病藥物政策，俾更多患者可以得到適當嘅治療同藥物。
It's a policy problem. For example, from approval, typically after the USDA and the European Union approves treatment, Canada takes 12 to 18 months to approve. There needs to be a better system. Perhaps this requires a regulatory body that works worldwide or in tandem with other agencies to seek approval. I mean, but there needs to be definitely a review of policies and how this is, how it is funded, how it is approved, and how it's managed, and how we get this to patients as soon as possible.
好啦，今集嘅節目時間又差唔多啦。如果觀眾對我哋嘅節目有任何意見嘅話，歡迎以電郵嘅方式聯絡我哋。咁觀眾亦都可以上網睇返今集嘅節目內容。下星期起1連4星期同樣時間將會播出精華回顧，請留意收睇。下星期再見。